Okay, so far what we have on the table is the prediction from Deuteronomy 20 through 30 of conquest, destruction, exile, worldwide scatter, survival, and return. The next thing I want to talk about is the revelation at Sinai. And what I want to focus on is the question, is it a real historical event or is it a myth? Myths are very common throughout the world, especially in ancient religions. What reason do we have to think that this is a real historical event and not a myth? Now, I've been presenting these ideas for about 10 years or more on the internet. There seems to be a certain difficulty in understanding exactly what I'm getting at. So I've tried to present it in different ways, in different orders, different facets. I haven't found a way that's perfectly successful. I'm going to try something a little bit different this time. Maybe it will be an improvement. What I want to do is give you a very brief summary of the pieces of the argument. What I'm going to tell you now is missing a lot, and it's open to obvious objections, and it's not carefully defined. But I'd like the building to be clear, the basic structure. And then I'll go back through in detail, and then we can discuss every move. I would like this to be understood. I think for me it's very important that it be understood. It is a cornerstone of having adequate reason to believe, especially since the revelation at Sinai is absolutely fundamental to the entire religion. A great deal of religious life is carrying out commandments. If you haven't got a solid reason to believe in a commander, then there aren't any commandments. And then the whole thing falls to pieces. Now, there are two pieces in the discussion. One piece is an idea, an intuition, a feeling that's meant to motivate. Just motivate. Get the things off the ground. Make the question interesting. Make it something which is worth discussing and analyzing. It's not supposed to do the job. It's not supposed to convince. It's not supposed to be the reason why you accept it. It's just an idea which orients us mentally to get us off the ground. Then we have to go through the guts of the argument and find what the real evidence is, what the real reason is. So the introduction is just an intuitive introduction. And the introduction addresses following very limited question. Could we imagine someone making up this story of a revelation at Sinai if it weren't true? Could we imagine someone making up that story? Inventing it, just dreaming it up, and then coming to a group of people and saying to them, this is your history. This is what happened to you. And I think intuitively, that idea faces an obstacle. Imagine the guy, let's call him the faker. He comes to a group of people. He says to them, guess what? 300 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, your entire ancestry, all of your ancestors together stood at a mountain and heard God speak. I'm revealing to you something about your own national history, something that happened to all of your ancestors. Take any number of years ago you like. 300 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. That's what happened to your ancestors. I think intuitively, we would expect the people he's talking to say, well, if that really happened, how come we don't know about it? You're telling us something about our own ancestors. You're telling us something colossal, that our ancestors all heard God speak. What happened? They forgot about it? They were more interested in the evening soccer scores and just lost track of it? I mean, that doesn't sound like the sort of thing that people are just going to forget, lose track of, you know. he's going to have trouble convincing them. Remember, he's making this up. He's a faker. He's making this up. He's going to have trouble convincing them that this is true because it's the kind of story which is so spectacular, we would normally expect it to be remembered. So that's the starting intuition. Now, that's not an argument. That's not an argument. It's not even really good evidence, I think, because I can imagine a critic saying, look, your intuition is that people draw a line as to what they will believe. They won't believe just anything. Some things are too incredible to believe. I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you. I think people are soft-headed, especially 2,500 years ago. I think people were very uncautious. They were inclined to fantasies. Maybe the king had special powers, or maybe they believed that the priests had special powers. Maybe they fed them drugs. I don't know. I'm not convinced. And if a critic says that, frankly, up to here, I don't know what I could say to him. To me, it seems obvious that there's going to be a substantial obstacle. And he says, no, to me it's not obvious. I don't think it is a substantial obstacle. So I have my intuition, he has his intuition. It doesn't make an argument, doesn't mean he's wrong, doesn't defeat him, doesn't present any strong reason to think that my intuition is better than his intuition. That's why I'm at pains to point out that the intuition is not what does the job. What does the job is real evidence. And I can present real evidence, and I will present real evidence in detail. And then the argument is carried by the real evidence. That's the way it's built. Are we together so far? So it's very important to keep the two steps apart. I don't know how many dozens and dozens of emails I have answered where the writer says, well, you think people won't believe things like that? Well, I think people will believe things like that. And just dismisses the whole thing. And I go through the writings that I have on the subject, and I copy and paste where I explain that that wasn't the job, and so forth and so on. But when they read it, they don't see that. They just don't see it. They get stuck on the intuition, and they just don't share the intuition. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through the two pieces. Now, before we do that, I have to introduce a preliminary, which is important here, and it's important everywhere. It's an important piece of philosophy. So I'm going to start with that as a kind of beginning footnote, and then we'll get into the two pieces. We're talking about adequate reason to believe. How much reason is that? To believe anything. To believe you know who your parents are, or to believe that Australia is an island continent, or to believe that Pluto is now a dwarf planet instead of a full-fledged planet, or anything. I don't care what it is. What does it mean to have adequate reason to believe something? Now, there's a prejudice on this issue. Maybe the word prejudice is a little too strong. But at any rate, I'm going to oppose it, so I'll call it prejudice. There's a prejudice on this issue that to have adequate reason to believe something is to prove it. And I think that's a mistake. I think proving it is the wrong move. I think it's the wrong criterion. It's the wrong substance of adequate reason. It's a seriously wrong move. I'll explain to you what a proof is, what I'm opposing. I'll explain to you why I think it's a mistake and what I think is the correct move. If we don't agree on this, all the rest is going to be worthless. It's going to be worthless. First of all, I'm not going to fight with anybody's English. You can use words as you please, more or less. In my vocabulary, proof means something that settles the issue absolutely. When you present a proof, all questions are over. All doubt is dispelled. You know for sure, absolutely, with certainty, infallibly, that it's true. The model for proof is mathematics. Proofs have been given for proposition mathematics, some of them more than 2,000 years old. And in 2,000 years, no one has found any reason whatsoever to question them. Well, no one, almost no one. We'll talk about that perhaps a little later. But almost no one has found any reason to question them. As solid as proof is, you have it in mathematics, and you have it in very simple areas of philosophy, pure logic. Human experience reveals them to be as absolute as anything can be. Person uses the word proof, if that's what he means, then he's taking that use of proof and applying it to other areas. You could apply it to science, you could apply it to history, you could apply it to psychology, you could apply it to psychology. I will exclude that from science, and other things. The question is whether that's appropriate. How do you know? Give me a proof. Now, first of all, let's just note one little detail about how proof works. Somebody says he has a proof, and somebody else can dream up any possibility of his being wrong that defeats the proof. Because if there's any possibility that he's wrong, then the proof isn't absolute. It hasn't closed every door. There's still the possibility that you're making a mistake. A proof has to close off every other possibility. Which means that if somebody offers a proof, it's always kosher to respond, but isn't it still possible that Q? And if he acknowledges that it's still possible that Q and that he's wrong, then he has to admit he doesn't have a proof. So looking for a proof sets up this kind of dialogue. Someone says he knows something. You say, how do you know? And when you say that, you mean, prove it. And he says, PQR. Then you start working your imagination. Oh, PQR. PQR is his proof that he's right. But even if PQR, couldn't Z make it wrong? Isn't Z a possibility that makes it wrong? You confront him and say, what about Z? He thinks, we're using PQR. What about Z? What about Z? I don't know. No, maybe Z. Then you lose it. Then you've lost the proof. The person who provides a proof is inviting defeat on the basis of mere opposing imagination. It's that kind of dialogue that I'm against. Yeah.
Why would something irrational then be able to still defeat the proof? I don't know if that's the right word, logical or illogical, dreaming up of possibilities.
Let me see. I'm not sure where you're coming from. You're saying that proofs can't be defeated by mere imagination?
Well, I'm asking if the possibility that he's saying is just totally irrational.
What would you mean by irrational? You know it's false? Then it's not a possibility. No, no. Possibility means something which I haven't ruled out.
Oh.
So it's this kind of dialogue that I'm against. Now let's see why we should be against it. Remember, we're looking for adequate reason. Adequate reason. We're investigating a person that says, I'll tell you what adequate reason is. Adequate reason is proof, period. Proof and nothing but proof. Only proof. And I'm wondering whether we should take him seriously or look for an alternative. Let's see. Let's just take a few examples. I take it you all know who your parents are. Do you have adequate reason for thinking you know who your parents are? Until we start this discussion, I think everyone has always assumed he has adequate reason. Do you have a proof? Is there any possibility that you're wrong? That maybe you're really adopted and they didn't tell you? Is it possible? Of course it's possible. You say you look just like them? That's because when they went to the adoption agency, they took their baby pictures along and picked out a baby that looked like their baby pictures. That's why you look like them. You say you did a DNA check. Well, first of all, I know you did not. And second of all, DNA checks are only good to about 96%. And third of all, suppose you did a DNA check, but how would you know that your parent, or maybe I should say those people, didn't pay off the lab to lie to you about the results? How would you know for sure that that didn't happen? You couldn't know that. So could you possibly have a proof that they're your parents? Doesn't look like it. Shall we then say that you're believing that they're your parents is just prejudice on your part, just, idle, childish, lack of critical thinking and so forth and so on? Surely not. You have a raft of evidence that they are your parents. Yes, there are adoptions. What percentage of children living in families are adopted? 0.0000001%. It's possible, but experience is vastly against it. The mere fact that it's possible that you're adopted should not be a good enough reason to give up thinking that they are your parents and you have adequate reason to believe they're your parents. Adequate reason doesn't require proof. That's the message here. Adequate reason doesn't require proof. Here's another example, more extreme example. The fellow who got us into this pickle was named René Descartes, one of the founders of modern philosophy. He said adequate reason is proof. That's the position that he held. Why did he hold that? Because he thought he could provide one. He thought he had a proof which restored the vast majority of things that you believe about the world based on proof. That's what he thought. He only used proof because he thought he could meet it. Later generations felt that his way of meeting it was not binding, was not valid. And then the question became central. Well, if we can prove almost nothing, so then what should we agree is our standard? And they were looking for, since then we've been looking for weaker standards for 300 years, 350 years. And he started like this. Can you prove at this very moment that you're not dreaming? That in 2 minutes you won't wake up in the 23rd century and say, that's what I get for reading history books. Look at that. I dreamt myself back to this weird place 150 years ago, and weird things going on. And I live, on Mars and so on and so on. What could you do now to prove that in 2 minutes you won't wake up in the 23rd century? Since Descartes asked the question, no one has come up with any considerations that would establish for sure, infallibly, that what you are living now isn't a dream. So now, how should I feel about this? Then maybe it is a dream. Maybe everything I think I know about the world is just a dream world. Maybe I really live someplace else. Should you worry about that? Should you become cavalier about shooting people on the grounds that, maybe it's all a dream? Nobody's really going to die. They're just my dream fantasies. I don't think you should do that. Bertrand Russell updated this thought about 100 years ago. He put it this way. What could you do to prove that the universe is more than 5 minutes old? You've probably heard debates about how old the universe is. Yeah, but nobody's thinking of 5 minutes. 5 minutes old. So you say, 5 minutes old? Come on, I remember yesterday. Maybe 5 minutes ago, you came into existence with those engravings on your cerebellum, wherever memory is. Nobody knows where memory is. Okay. We have engravings in your brain which encode what we should call now pseudo-memories, and it never really happened. What could you do to prove that the world is more than 5 minutes old? Since Bertrand Russell asked this question, no one has come up with a convincing answer. Should you worry about this? Listen, you're an honest person. You're a fair person. You believe in justice. You lent money to somebody 2 weeks ago. Are you going to collect it? Can you prove there was a 2 weeks ago? Maybe there wasn't. Maybe everything came into existence 5 minutes ago. If the guy you lent it to says, look, you want to get your money back? Prove to me, prove to yourself. You're an honest person. You want to do what's just? Prove to yourself that the universe is more than 5 minutes old and you really lent me the money. If you can't, then don't ask me for the money. Are you going to take that seriously? I hope not. Certainly hope not. Even though I can't prove these things, I have every adequate reason to say I'm not dreaming and the universe is more than 5 minutes old. The reason in both cases is that in both cases of dreaming and the universe being 5 minutes old, all the critic is offering is a possibility. He's only offering a mere possibility. He's inviting me to rule out a possibility. That is, he's inviting me to give a proof. Correct response to the critic is, you give me some positive reason for thinking that I'm dreaming. You give me some positive reason for thinking the universe is only 5 minutes old. You give me a positive reason. Don't demand that I rule out your possibility. Possibilities are cheap. They don't count. Give me a positive reason for thinking that what you say is true, then I'll have to take you seriously. You give me a positive reason for thinking it's true, I'll have to look for positive reasons for thinking it's not true. And we'll weigh up the reasons and see who has better reasons. But just offering a possibility cuts no ice. It doesn't count. Now, this is absolutely crucial because this goes on in discussions of absolute morality. This goes on in discussions of God. The critic always says, Well, prove it. Prove morality is absolute. And when you give your reasons, he says, maybe it's ET, extraterrestrials. Or maybe it was just an accident. Or maybe. And the key word in those suggestions is maybe. When a person says maybe, that's a point to draw a line. When a person says maybe, the correct response is, of course, maybe. Of course. I agree with you, maybe. So what? Maybes carry no weight. Isn't it possible that? Sometimes they ask the question this way. How do you know it's not? How do you know it's not something else? The correct response is, do you have any positive reason for thinking it is that something else? Any positive reason? You have a positive reason? Let's hear it, and then we'll discuss it. You'll give your positive reasons, I'll give my positive reasons, we'll weigh them up. But you ask me how I know it's not, and you have no positive reasons for thinking that it is, at that point I say, you're suggesting a possibility. I agree to all possibilities. Everything's possible. Leprechauns are possible also. Hobbits are possible also. Everything's possible. But so what? Possibilities don't count. This is a crucial lesson in all of your intellectual life, in discussing, debating, and analyzing, in arguing. Never to get stuck on possibilities or maybes or how do you know it's not. Now, if we can agree on that, then we can move forward to the actual positive evidence. That's absolutely crucial. Okay, I'm putting that on the table. As always, tomorrow we'll go back over this, and I'll be happy to discuss it at any length you want. It's very important to get clear on this. Okay, now.
I have a question. Still trying to figure out everything.
Yeah.
But doesn't adequate reason in itself lead you to believe that there could be other possibilities if you have adequate reason?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Adequate reason just means the evidence is so strongly on my side that I have adequate reason to commit myself to my side, unless and until someone will give me better evidence for one of those other possibilities.
You can still have maybes and other possibilities.
Just like your parents. Think of how it is. Now that I've pointed out that it could be that you're adopted, so now in your mind you have a maybe. Yeah, maybe I am adopted. But the right attitude is, okay, but so what? Okay. I've had all my experience. I have the statistics of all the other people who are in the world who are involved. That maybe doesn't deprive me of my adequate reason to treat them as my parents, to believe that they're my parents. That's the crucial thing, to live with maybes. Okay. To live, I think you're putting it well, to live with maybes and yet be committed to the thing that you have the most reason to accept.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're conceding that we can't prove that this is not a dream, and we're conceding that we can't prove that the universe is more than 5 minutes old.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, since they raised those questions, no one has succeeded in providing a proof. But we rightly don't take those possibilities seriously because they're just possibilities. They're possibilities without any evidence whatsoever. Okay, now I want to work, as I said, on the first step, the intuition. There are a number of ways to do this. I wrote an essay. By the way, the basic argument is written up on my website in something called Living Up to the Truth, where it's written up in some detail. Then also in the miscellaneous section, there's an introduction to what I call the Kuzari principle, which is what I'm working on now. It's long, repetitive, clear, simple, down to earth. I'm going to summarize that for you now, but this is written out in detail. Again, we're talking about somebody making up a false story. We're talking about our attitude towards memory. I want to bring you through a few examples of this, just the idea. Again, this is just the intuition. Intuition is clear enough to rely on as an intuition. Somebody tells you that yesterday you took out your cell phone and you tried twice to dial the same number, and both times you misdialed, and the third time you got it. Let's suppose you don't remember that. He claims he saw you do it, and you don't remember it. Most people, I think, would be inclined to say, it happens. I dial quickly, and I make a mistake. Do I remember every time I misdial, or even misdial twice? No, it's too trivial. It's too trivial an event. It could happen. It could happen that he was watching me, and he saw me do it. I did it. My mind was on other things, and that's why I misdialed. And I finally talked to the guy, and it just slipped my memory. I don't see any reason why I couldn't accept that, even though I don't remember it. I'm not going to use my blank memory as a reason to think he's lying to me about what happened to me. But suppose he tells you that yesterday you went swimming and you don't remember it. I think then you're going to be very reluctant to accept it. You're going to say, I don't go swimming that often, certainly not in Jerusalem. You know, if I went swimming yesterday, I certainly would remember it. That's not the sort of thing that I forget. When a person tells you about your own personal experience, recent experience, there's a clear dividing line between, and you don't remember what he tells you, your memory's blank, there's a clear dividing line between what you're going to treat as a reasonable story about you and what you're going to treat as an unreasonable story about you. Now let's take events further back in your history. You're, I don't know, 21 years old. Somebody says, when you were 5 and you were in kindergarten, your teacher got sick and was out for a month, and there was a substitute, and you didn't like that substitute. And you were very upset with the substitute. And you think, golly, I don't remember that. 21, 16 years ago, substitute in kindergarten. I don't remember that at all. Are you inclined to say, and therefore it must be false? It couldn't be true because lots of people remember very little about being 5 years old. And that doesn't sound like a traumatic event that would be so important that maybe you remember 16 years ago. 16 years later, if your parents tell you this, you might say, okay, so I forgot it. Contrast that with being told that 16 years ago when you were 5, you broke your leg. You were in a cast for 6 weeks, and all the other kids were running races, and you were very upset, and your friend signed the cast, you know, with various, okay, so you were 7 years old. They signed the cast, they drew pictures on your cast, and so on, and you don't remember it. Now I think you're going to be worried. What? Broke my leg? So I was cast for 6 weeks. Everybody was running races and I couldn't run. I don't remember that? That doesn't sound too likely. Even 16 years later, even when I was a 5-year-old, breaking my leg and being in a cast for 6 weeks is the kind of thing that I would remember. And I think that, given those two examples, we'd be very confident about that. Now, the type of event where you could easily accept the story, even though you don't remember it, I call a forgettable. Forgettable means the kind of thing which it would be natural to forget. So that when somebody tells you a story about what happened to you, the way you weigh it up is you say, well, is this a forgettable or not? If it's a forgettable, then I could trust him that he's telling me something which I forgot. But if it's not, it's an unforgettable, like going swimming yesterday, or like breaking your leg when you were 5 and being in a cast for 6 weeks, then I'm not going to trust him. I trust my memory better than I trust him. Now let's expand it. Let's not talk about your personal history. Let's talk about your family history. So somebody says, I've been doing research on your great-grandparents. And they lived in Poland. And your great-grandfather was put in jail on a false charge of stealing, anti-Semitism, and he spent 3 weeks in jail, and then he escaped. You've never heard anything about this. Okay, it's my great-grandfather. This took place 130 years ago. How much do I know about my great-grandfather? Did I ever hear a biography of him? Did I ever hear anything about his life? I have a picture of him, and I know about it. I know his name. This guy's been doing research in Polish history, and he came across his name. Could very well be. Not the sort of thing that naturally a family will remember. It's a family forgettable. But suppose that the fellow comes and tells you your great-grandfather was, I don't know what they had in those days, the equivalent of Nobel Prize, or knighted by the Polish Empire, and made the governor of a province in Poland, and became fabulously rich and corresponded with Rothschilds, and negotiated with the King of England, and so forth and so on. I think at that point you're going to say, oh, come on, it's my great-grandfather. That kind of prominence, that kind of fame, that would be preserved. The family would remember that 4 generations. That's the sort of thing that people are going to forget. So you have the same dividing line between, with respect to family history, what's reasonably accepted as a forgettable and what isn't. Now let's talk about city history. Someone says that in New York in 1895 there was a terrible drought and people died of thirst and there was hoarding of water and the police had to go out and ration water and so forth and so on. 1895. This went on for 6 months. It's now 2015. You don't remember that. You look up popular histories of New York, it's not there. Okay. Water droughts happen often enough, and people hoard things. Could it be missing from the history books? Maybe so. Now somebody says in 1895 there was an earthquake in New York, and 3/4 of the buildings were leveled. Thousands of people died. There was an emergency government for 3 years, trying to deal with the resources and everything else. No one remembers this. This isn't in any history books. At that point, I think we'd be suspicious. That's too big an event, like the San Francisco fire that burnt down most of San Francisco. Everybody in San Francisco knows about that. Everybody remembers that because it was a disaster. Earthquake in 1895 in New York would have been a gigantic disaster. That's a line between city forgettables and unforgettables. Now you can do the same thing for nations. You can do the same thing for national history. Imagine someone making up a story about medieval England. In 1350, there was a terrible blight that killed horses. Now horses are used for the army, and horses are used for agriculture, and horses are used for transportation and communication. It was a terrible blight. For 10 years, there were virtually no horses to be had, and people took up jobs running messages from place to place because there was no alternative, right? 1350. For 10 years this went on. Maybe someone claims he discovered archaeologically or something. And it's not in the history books. I think we would say, okay, for them it was a big deal, but 100 years later, 200 years later, 300, why would anybody remember that? It's not such a big thing in historical terms, in national historical terms. Suppose somebody says that in 1350, England conquered most of Europe, invaded and conquered most of Europe, and held Europe captive for 75 years, and taxed Europe, and projected the English language into Europe, and so forth and so on, whatever English was in 1350. And then little by little they got beaten back, and the natives hated the English, and they destroyed all the English language, and so forth and so on. I think at that point we would say, excuse me, conquering most of Europe and holding it under you for 75 years is a gigantic national accomplishment. The British wouldn't have forgotten that. Sure, the British wouldn't have forgotten it. They'd celebrate it as one of the great events in British history. It couldn't be that that's true and the whole of the British people forgot about it. It's just not credible to think that an event of that magnitude would be forgotten. So again, in national history, you have the line between a national forgettable and a national unforgettable. Okay, it's the same story over and over again. From immediate personal experience to long-term personal experience to family experience to city experience to national experience. It's the same line. Again, I'm just outlining an intuition. That's all. Just a state of mind. This is not an argument, just a state of mind. Now, given this state of mind, it seems to me that the revelation at Sinai counts as a national unforgettable. It's not like having a blight on the horses and for 10 years having to use other means of transportation and communication. The idea of a revelation from the creator of the universe, now I'm going to put in a footnote, which some of you may have thought of, and this is important to avoid a certain objection later. I'm talking about how they experienced it. They experienced it as an interaction with the creator of the universe. That's the way they heard it. That they experienced, their experience was for them an experience of hearing the creator of the universe speak in a totally miraculous setting, fire on the mountaintop and the earth shaking under their feet, and smoke and cloud over the and the sound of the shofar and the whole thing, the whole story. That's a national unforgettable. It's not the sort of thing which, if you tried to make it up 300 years later or 500 years later, when it really didn't happen, not the sort of thing which you expect people to say, oh yeah, I could imagine that. We forgot about it, that's all. Got interested in other things and lost track of it. It's just too spectacular to think of as the sort of thing that you could expect to forget. That's the intuition that we're dealing with. Now, all this intuition addresses is, could somebody make it up? Are we together so far? This is just the intuition. The critic will now come back with two remarks, and both of them are, I think, correct. Up to here, they're correct, and that's the reason why we have to do much more. One remark will be, I don't share your intuition. First of all, you're influenced by the fact that you're living in 2015. You don't know how primitive people were 2,500 years ago. They could believe anything. There's no limit on what they could believe. They weren't critical the way you are, the way people are today. So you're projecting your own resistance on them. Secondly, the critic will say, and this with justice, he'll say, you're painting the picture of two extreme alternatives. One is that it really happened, and the other is that somebody made it up out of whole cloth and tried to sell it all in one shot. Now, maybe you have an intuition against making it up and selling it all in one shot, but that's not the only other alternative. There are other alternatives. There's something called myth formation, where you start off with a story, and as the story is told over again and again and again from generation to generation, it changes gradually, it grows, people add elements, they elevate it. And you could have a story about a really natural event in over 100 years, 200, 300, 500 years, telling it over and changing some of the details, not remembering it very well, different versions. You could elevate it into the story of a miracle or a revelation. You're leaving that out, the critic will say. You're creating a false alternative that it's either it really happened or somebody made it up. That's not true. There are other ways in which it could happen. And given what I've said so far, I think the critic is right. Number one, I've not given any convincing reason why he has to share our intuition. And number two, it's true. I set up two possibilities. It happened or it was made up. That's not fair. You have to consider in between possibilities, and I will consider them in detail. But we can draw this conclusion. I think I would ask the critic to agree to this. The fact that an event falls on the side of the national unforgettables is the sort of thing we wouldn't expect people to forget, a nation to forget, means that there's some obstacle in accepting the story. There's some obstacle. Now, maybe we disagree as to how big the obstacle is. Maybe I think intuitively that the obstacle is so big no one could jump over it. And he thinks, yes, an obstacle, but people who believe that the priests have supernatural powers, or the king who has special powers, or feeding them drugs, in some cases you could jump over the obstacle. That would be the difference between us. We both agree there is an obstacle. Question is, how strong is the obstacle? Is the obstacle really so absolute that you can't jump over it? Or is it something which, on occasion, you could jump over, in which case the intuition doesn't settle the issue? If that's the way the critic puts his case, then up to here, I think the critic has a good case. We have much more work to do. We have to show positive evidence that the obstacle is so strong it always works. We need positive evidence that the obstacle is so strong it always works, that no one ever jumps over that obstacle. And that no one jumps over that obstacle not because of a charlatan or a faker who makes it up, not even when you take into account the gradual development of stories, changing and elevating them and aggrandizing them over time. The evidence has to close off both of those. And that's what I claim I can do. I claim that I can close off both of them. Okay? We're together? But that's enough for today. Tomorrow I will summarize all of this again. And if any questions have come up in 23 hours, I'll be happy to talk about them. And then we'll push on to look at the evidence. Okay?